They called me Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of all Russia, the woman who ruled the largest empire in the world. But before I became the one you know from history, I was just Sophie, a little princess from an insignificant German principality, a girl who dreamed of love, of family, of happiness. But fate had set me on a different path. I was sent to a foreign land, married to a man I didn't love. They took my name, my language, my faith. They took away everything I was. But I learned to survive. And then I learned to rule. My story is not just about power and glory. It's about loneliness, betrayal, love and pain. It's about a woman who had it all, and yet nothing. Listen to my story. The story of Catherine the Great. I was born on 2nd of May 1729 in the small German town of Stettin, now Szczecin in Poland. My maiden name was Sophie Frederica Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst, a long name for a little girl who dreamed of fairy tales. My father, Christian August, was a prince from a small German principality. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich either. We weren't powerful, just mere nobles in a sea of hundreds of others. My mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was an ambitious woman. She loved power, prestige, social contacts. But me, she loved me less. I remember her comparing me to other children, how she told me I wasn't pretty enough, that I wasn't smart enough, that I had to be better to achieve anything. And so I tried. My childhood was not a happy one. My mother was cold. My father was away a lot, serving in the Prussian army. And me? I was lonely. I spent hours in my room, reading books. I loved stories of knights, princesses, and love. I dreamed of one day finding my prince, that I would be loved. But the reality was different. Then one day when I was 14, a message came that changed my life. Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna, the ruler of Russia, invited us to visit her in St. Petersburg. Why? Because her nephew, Grand Duke Peter Fyodorovich, needed a bride, and my mother, always ambitious, saw an opportunity. I remember the day she told me. I was sitting at the window looking out over the garden, and she came in with a letter in her hand. "Sophie," she said coldly, "you're going to Russia. You're going to marry the future Tsar." My heart stopped. Russia! A distant, chilling country. A place I knew almost nothing about. And the future Tsar, a man I'd never met. But did I have a choice? No, I didn't. I was a princess without power. My fate was decided by others. In January 1744, we set out on a journey to Russia. It was cold, a bitter, freezing winter. The journey took weeks. We drove through snow and ice, across endless plains. I was scared all the way. I was afraid of what was coming. I was afraid of the man I was about to meet. I was afraid of the future. But at the same time, I felt something else. Hope. Maybe I could find love there. Maybe I'd find happiness there. Maybe. But the truth was very different. When we finally arrived in St. Petersburg, I was stunned. The city was magnificent. Palaces, temples, wide streets. Everything was so different from home. But then I saw it. Peter, my future husband. He stood there, a thin, pale boy with a nervous look. He was 16, 2 years older than me. And when I looked at him, my heart sank. He wasn't the prince of fairy tales. He wasn't strong, charismatic, attractive. He was weak, But the worst part was something else. When he looked at me, I saw indifference in his eyes. He didn't care. Not at all. Then I was introduced to Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna. She was a powerful woman. Beautiful, authoritative, with a penetrating gaze that seemed to see right into your soul. She looked me over from head to toe, and then she said, "You're small and not very pretty. But you have intelligent eyes. That's good." It wasn't praise. It was an evaluation. Then she added, "Forget who you were. From now on, you're the future Grand Duchess of Russia. You will learn our language, you will embrace our faith, and you will serve Russia." Her words were cold, but I understood them. I wasn't here to be happy. I was here to serve. A few months after I arrived, I was baptized into the Orthodox faith. My old life, Sophie, was over. I was given a new name, Yekaterina Alexeyevna. In English, Katharina. I stood in a church, surrounded by strangers, in a strange land, with a strange name. And I understood. I would never be who I was again. After my baptism, I lived in a palace. I had beautiful clothes, servants, everything I could want. But I was lonely. Peter ignored me. He spent his time playing with the soldiers, drinking and playing silly pranks. He didn't care about me. Not one bit. Mother? She was busy with intrigue and politics. And me? I spent my nights in bed, alone, crying. I cried for a girl named Sophie who dreamed of love. I cried for the life I'd lost. But the tears didn't change anything. And that's how I learned to be strong. One day, I realized something important. If I want to survive in this yard, I can't be weak. I can't wait for love. I can't wait for happiness. I must take it myself. And so, I began to study. The Russian language, Russian culture, politics. I read books. I listened to mentors. I learned from the most powerful people in the court. And slowly, day by day, I changed. I was no longer Sophie, a little lonely princess. I was becoming Catherine. My story was just beginning. I had no idea what was in store for me. Betrayals, intrigue, love, pain. And finally, the throne. I was 16 years old when I was married to Peter. I remember that day. August the 21st, 1745. A grand wedding in St. Petersburg. Hundreds of guests, beautiful dresses, music, dancing. Everyone was smiling. Everyone celebrating. But me, I was standing next to a man I didn't know, who I didn't love. And when I looked into his eyes, I saw emptiness. Peter was strange. He wasn't evil, not directly, but he was childish. He spent hours playing with toy soldiers. He had whole armies of little figures that he organized and moved around the table, giving them orders like he was a real general. He loved Prussia and admired King Friedrich II of Prussia. He wore the Prussian uniform, talked about Prussian military power, dreamed of one day leading an army like Friedrich. But Russia, the land he was one day to rule, he hated it. He despised Russian culture, Russian traditions, Russian people. He talked openly about how Prussia was better than Russia. And me, his wife, the future mother of his heirs. He didn't care about me at all. The wedding night was a disaster. Every woman dreams that her first night with her husband will be filled with love, tenderness, passion. But my wedding night? Peter came in drunk. He staggered into the bedroom, laughed, said something unintelligible. And then he fell asleep. I lay in bed alone, in my white wedding dress, crying. It wasn't just disappointment. It was humiliation. I felt unwanted, worthless. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And our marriage? It remained empty. Peter ignored me. When we were together, he treated me coldly, indifferently. He spent most of his time with his friends, with his toys, with alcohol. And the yard? The yard was waiting. They were waiting for the heir, for the son who would one day rule Russia. But no son came, because my marriage was not real. And Karevna Elizabeth was impatient. She called me to her and asked me, "When will you give me an heir? Why don't you have a child yet?" What was I to say to her? That my husband refused me? That our marriage was only on paper? I didn't dare say it out loud. But she knew. Everyone knew. And I felt shame. It wasn't my fault, but I was the one they blamed. Peter had a mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. She wasn't pretty, nor intelligent. But Peter loved her. Or at least, he spent time with her. I watched him laugh with her, holding her hand, giving her the attention he never gave me. I felt betrayed, humiliated. But there was nothing I could do. I was just a Grand Duchess without power. To escape the loneliness and pain, I immersed myself in books. I read. I studied. I studied philosophy, history, politics. I read Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, thinkers of the Enlightenment. Their ideas about freedom, reason, and justice fascinated me. I learned Russian perfectly, better than Peter. I was learning about Russian culture. I loved it. More than Peter, who hated it. And I was slowly realizing, I'm more Russian than he is. I wasn't alone in the courtyard. Gradually, I got to know people who respected me, who knew I was intelligent, capable, committed to Russia. One of them was Sergei Saltykov, a young, handsome nobleman. He started talking to me, listening to me, respecting me. And for the first time in my life, I felt that someone saw my worth. Saltykov was attentive, kind. He saw me. I was lonely, desperate for love. We started spending time together. We talked, we laughed. And then what was bound to happen happened. I fell in love. No, maybe I didn't fall in love. Maybe I just desperately needed someone to love me. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a betrayal. I felt it as a rescue. In 1754, I gave birth to a son. They named him Pavel Petrovich. I should have been happy. I finally had a child. I had finally done my duty. But Tsarina Elizabeth took him from me. She took him away right after the birth. She said she would raise him. I haven't seen him for weeks. When I wanted to see him, I had to ask permission. He wasn't my son. He was the son of a Russian. And me? I was just the instrument that birthed him. Was Paul Peter's son? I don't know. Maybe he was Saltykov's. Maybe Peter's. Maybe it wasn't important. What was important? That Russia had an heir. After Paul was born, my relationship with Peter deteriorated. He despised me. He blamed me. He treated me with hostility. We didn't speak to each other. When we met, we didn't even look at each other. The marriage was dead. but I survived. And slowly, I realized something important. If I wanted to survive in Russia, I had to be stronger than him. A loveless marriage didn't break me. It made me stronger. It taught me that love is weakness, that power is everything, and I was ready to get that power, at any cost. The court of the Russian Tsar was not a place of joy, but a battlefield. Cautiously. Every word, every look, every smile had its price and its danger. Thoughtful. After arriving in St. Petersburg, I quickly realized that power was not acquired there by birthright alone. It is gained by those who are cautious, cunning, and without mercy. And I was the only woman who wanted to survive and become a winner. I could never trust anyone. Not my husband, not my courtiers, not my friends. I saw treachery and intrigue creeping slowly around me. The women of the court vied for power and the favour of Empress Elizabeth. The men had their own plans and alliances. Each wanted to gain something: power, wealth, influence. And me? I was just a foreigner with a German name who had nothing. Tsarina Elizabeth was a beautiful but tough woman. She ruled with an iron hand and didn't like weakness. She watched me with a critical eye, and far from her eyes she made it clear that I was here to serve, first and foremost. I often felt like a pawn in her power play. But inside me, determination grew. I didn't just need to survive. I needed power. I began to look for allies. There were men like Grigory Orlov and his brothers who saw me as more than just a Tsarina in waiting. With them, I began to build my own network of influence. They shared my dreams of victory and power. Every day I had to be vigilant. Rumours spread. Conspiracies were unravelling. Some wanted to destroy me before I could show my courage, but I had one advantage. I was smarter, more perceptive. I learned to play the game of court like a master. Every smile measured strength. Every word hid a weapon. I balanced politics and power, manipulation and truth. And I never forgot. He who has power over the minds of others has power over the realm. Not a day was lost. Every conversation, every move, every friendship was ready for future use. I knew the time was coming when I had to intervene. The time was approaching when Sophie would cease to be a girl from Germany and become Catherine the Great, Tsarina of Russia. Survival at court was the first battle, and I was ready to win it. Years of waiting, years of humiliation, years of silence. But the silence has an end. In 1761, Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna died. The woman who ruled Russia with an iron hand. The woman who brought me to this palace as a young, naive girl. And now, her death marked a change. My husband, Peter III, became Tsar. I became Tsarina. But not for long. Peter finally became what he wanted, ruler of Russia. But instead of ruling with wisdom and strength, he destroyed everything he had. As soon as he ascended the throne, he began to make changes that shocked all of Russia. He made peace with Prussia, a country that Russia had just defeated in war. All the victories, the blood and sacrifices of the Russian army, he undid with a single signature. Why is that? Because he admired King Friedrich II of Prussia. And the Russian people? Russian soldiers? They felt betrayed. Peter had not only betrayed the army, he despised everything Russian. He wore a Prussian uniform even as Tsar. He refused to follow Orthodox traditions. He mocked Russian customs and culture. And what was the worst? He openly humiliated me. He ignored me at public meetings. He spoke of me with contempt. He called me a stupid German. And he put his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova, next to him, in the place that should have belonged to me. The court saw it. The army saw it. All Russia saw it. And slowly they began to hate Peter and respect me. And luckily, I had a friend, Grigory Orlov, who never left me. He stood by me when Peter humiliated me. He protected me when I was threatened. And more importantly, he planned. Grigory and his 4 brothers were officers in the guard. They had connections, they had influence, and they had an army behind them. One night, Grigory told me, "Catherine, Peter can't continue to rule. The army hates him. The people hate him. The Orthodox Church hates him. If he stays in power, Russia will collapse." I remained silent. I listened. And then he said the words that changed my life. "You must become Tsarina, and we will help you." And thus began our conspiracy. The conspiracy was not sudden. It was carefully planned. Grigory and his brothers began to build support among the officers and soldiers of the guard. They talked to them. They explained that Peter was weak, that he hated Russia, that he must be deposed. I remained silent, but my silence was consent. I knew what was happening, and I knew that if it failed, I would be dead. But I also knew, if I don't, I'll always be a shadow, a dangerous woman without power, and I wanted more. In June 1762, Peter made one last mistake. He ordered the Orthodox clergy to be subject to the state. He banned certain traditional rites. The Orthodox Church, one of the most powerful institutions in Russia, rebelled. And I knew my time had come. Nervously, the night before the coup, I didn't sleep. I was lying in bed, looking into the dark, thinking, what if it fails? What if they give us away? What if Peter has me executed? I was scared. I was very scared. But at the same time, I felt something else. Determination. All my life, I've been helpless. All my life, I followed orders. But this time, I decided. Early in the morning of June 28, 1762, I was awakened by one of Orlov's brothers. He told me it was time and that we had to go, now. I dressed quickly. No fancy clothes, just simple clothes. I left the palace and got into the carriage. We drove to Ismail Barracks, where the guard was waiting for me. When I arrived, I saw them. Hundreds of soldiers, officers. They were all waiting. And when they saw me, they started shouting, "Long live Tsarina Catherine! Death to the tyrant Peter!" I stood in front of them, and for the first time in my life, I felt real power. The soldiers knelt before me. One by one, they swore allegiance. "We are yours, Tsarina. We will lead you to the throne, and we will protect you with our lives." My heart was pounding like never before. And I spoke firmly, clearly, without hesitation. "Thank you, my faithful sons of Russia. Together we will restore the glory of our country. Together we will overthrow the tyrant who has betrayed this country." And they shouted again, "Long live Catherine! Long live the Tsarina!" We headed back to St. Petersburg. On the way, others joined us. Soldiers, officers, people from the streets. When we arrived in the capital, people took to the streets. They shouted my name, they waved. And I knew I had won. Peter was out of St. Petersburg at the time, in his summer palace. When he heard about the coup, he panicked. He tried to rally the army, But no one listened to him. He tried to escape, but he had nowhere to go. And finally, he capitulated. He sent me a letter. He begged for mercy. He offered to give up the throne if I let him go. I read the letter, and I felt nothing. No anger, no regret, just emptiness. Peter abdicated, officially abdicated the throne. I became Tsarina of Russia, not as the wife of the Tsar, but as ruler. The plot was successful. The coup was bloodless, and I have finally achieved what I have longed for all my life. Power. But the price of power, it was yet to come. It was the night when everything ended and everything began. The night Sophie disappeared from Germany and Catherine the Great, Tsarina of Russia, was born. After the coup, there was a quiet, tense calm. The people of St. Petersburg whispered and hoped for better times, but fear was still in the hearts of many. I myself felt a weight that seemed unbearable. It was not just the responsibility of the government, but the responsibility for the lives of millions of Russians, a legacy I wanted to build on. No one knew whether I would rule as a strong monarch or as a weak woman who had no right to the throne. I immediately took action. My supporters had to make sure that my rule was firm, that I was their Tsarina. I visited the army headquarters and ministerial meetings. I listened to the advice of experienced courtiers. I showed that I was not just a symbol, but a real ruler. I often worked late into the night, studying laws, plans and reports from across the empire. Although I was never Russian by birth, I tried to be one. I made the rounds of the nobles' mansions, listening to their needs, but demanding loyalty and respect. I also inspired confidence in the people. I accepted the common people, supported the development of schools and science, and expanded education. I knew that a strong Russia must be based on the unity of all its people. I decided to reform the army, to make it not only powerful and disciplined, but also open to new ideas. I promoted education, culture and science. I understood that the Enlightenment was not just a fashion, but the path to a modern empire. I also began to work on the legal system, so that Russia could stand on a solid foundation of justice and order. I continued. It was not an easy beginning. Peter, though abdicated, was still a dangerous shadow. He was eventually imprisoned and died in mysterious circumstances. Many say I was responsible for his death. But this controversy has not stopped me. I had to continue because Russia needed me as its ruler. And even though I grew up in pain and betrayal, my heart yearned for love now and then. Being a ruler meant more than just wearing a crown. It meant changing the world. In my chamber, surrounded by hundreds of books, I dreamed of a Russia that was not only powerful militarily, but also enlightened. A Russia where justice would prevail over arbitrariness, where education would conquer ignorance. I read Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, philosophers who fascinated me with their ideas about freedom, reason and progress. And slowly I realized, I want to be more than a Tsarina. I want to be a reformer. In 1767, I began writing my greatest project, the Nakaz. It was a code of laws inspired by Enlightenment philosophy. Hundreds of articles on how a just law should work, about how even the poorest subject has a right to a fair trial, that torture is barbaric, that the law must be the same for everyone. I spent nights writing, rewriting, perfecting every paragraph. It is better to prevent crime than to punish it, I wrote. The purpose of the law is not to terrorize people, but to lead them to virtue. Reading those lines aloud, I felt pride. but also loneliness. Who can understand the dream of a woman who wants to change the world? My reforms displeased many nobles. Why give rights to serfs? Why change what has worked for centuries, they said. I sat in the councils, surrounded by men in expensive coats who looked at me with suspicion. Sometimes I felt like I was fighting against everyone myself. But did I give up? I gave up. I knew progress hurt, but without pain, there is no birth. One of my most serious concerns was education. Russia was a country where most people couldn't even read, where ignorance ruled over wisdom, and I wanted to change that. I founded the first schools for girls in Russia. Yes, for girls. I knew what it meant to be a woman without education, without opportunity. I didn't want other women to suffer like me. I also opened schools for boys from all walks of life, not just for noblemen, but for the sons of artisans, merchants, peasants. When I visited the first of these schools, I saw the eyes of the children, hungry for knowledge, full of hope. And at that moment I knew, this is my greatest achievement. I wanted Russia to become the cultural centre of Europe. I invited painters, sculptors, architects from all over Europe. I built theatres, galleries, libraries. I founded the Hermitage, an art collection that became one of the largest in the world. I spent my evenings walking among paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, Da Vinci. I found these beautiful things soothing. They reminded me that the world could be beautiful, even if it was often cruel. But for all my successes, I was lonely. In the evenings, when the hustle and bustle of the yard died down, I sat in my library and read philosophy, poetry, history. I corresponded with Voltaire. He wrote me letters of admiration. "You are the most liberated monarch of Europe, Your Majesty." But what did he know of my loneliness? The nights I longed for someone who would love me not as a Tsarina, but as a woman. And then I saw him, Grigory. He was always by my side, strong, devoted, passionate. Did I love him? Yes, I loved him. But our love was complicated. He wanted marriage. He wanted official status. He wanted to be emperor. But I knew, if I married a Russian nobleman, I would lose respect. I would only be his wife, not his Tsarina. So I refused. One evening he said to me, tears in his eyes, "Katherine, I love you, but I feel like a shadow. Everyone knows I'm your lover, but no honour, no official position." I replied, "Grigory, you are more than a husband. You are my protector, my friend, my strength. But I cannot afford to be weak. Russia needs a strong Tsarina, not a woman in love." And I saw the pain in his eyes. But I hoped he would understand. I also supported scientific progress. I invited doctors, engineers, scientists to Russia. I encouraged research, the building of factories, the development of trade. One of my proudest achievements was Russia's first smallpox vaccination campaign. I was the first to be vaccinated, to show the people that there was nothing to fear. When the doctor stuck the needle in my arm, I felt no fear. I felt pride. This is how a nation is run, by example. But not everyone welcomed my reforms. Some said, "She's just a German princess trying to change Russian traditions." Others, "Why is she giving money for schools when people need bread?" And sometimes, in the solitude of my chamber, I doubted. Am I doing the right thing? Am I really making a difference?
Or am I just playing the enlightened monarch?
But then I remembered the eyes of those kids at school, the letters from Voltaire, the art in the Hermitage, and I knew My work has meaning. I was an enlightened despot. I ruled absolutely, but I tried to rule wisely. My reforms were not perfect, but they were a start. The beginning of a new Russia. Being an enlightened ruler meant not only reforming laws and promoting education, it also meant expanding Russia's borders to make it more powerful, bigger, stronger. And I knew there was only one way to do that: war. I didn't like bloodshed, but I understood that power and respect are not gained by words alone. It's earned through action, and often the cruelest ones. In 1768, war broke out with the Ottoman Empire, a powerful empire that controlled vast territories in the south. The Ottomans had been enemies of Russia for centuries. They prevented us from accessing the Black Sea, controlled the Crimea, and considered us barbarians from the north. But I wanted to change that balance of power. One of my greatest victories was the Battle of Cheshme in 1770. I sent the Russian fleet, led by the Eagle brothers, on a long, dangerous voyage around Europe, all the way to the Mediterranean. Many said it was madness, that the Russian ships would never arrive, that they would be lost, sunk, or destroyed. But I believed, and I was right. The Russian fleet surprised the Ottoman fleet and almost destroyed it in one night. Hundreds of Ottoman ships burned. Thousands of men died. When I mortoned the news of the victory, I sat in my palace, surrounded by maps and documents. I read the words, "The enemy is defeated. Victory is ours." And I felt, what? Joy? Not exactly. I felt relieved and sadness, because war is never pretty, even if you win. After years of fighting, we finally reached our goal, Crimea. In 1783, I annexed Crimea and made it part of Russia. It was a historic moment. For the first time in history, Russia had direct access to the warm waters of the Black Sea. I stood on the shore, looking at the blue sea and feeling the wind in my hair. And I thought, this is what I wanted. This is proof of my power, proof that a woman can rule as well as a man. But not all my expansions were glorious. One of the most controversial actions of my reign was the partition of Poland. Poland was weakened, divided by internal strife, and I saw an opportunity. Together with Prussia and Austria, we divided up Polish territory. Some would say it was a betrayal, that I had destroyed an entire nation. But I thought otherwise. If Poland can't govern itself, let someone else govern it, I said to myself. It was a cold calculation, politics without emotion. But that's power. That's the reality of government. But not all threats came from outside. In 1773, a huge uprising broke out inside Russia, led by Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack who claimed to be Tsar Peter III. Thousands of serfs, peasants and Cossacks joined him. They burned villages. They killed the nobles. They threatened my government. Pugachev promised freedom. He promised an end to serfdom. And the people believed him. When I got the news of the uprising, my heart stopped. This was not an enemy from a foreign land. It was my own people rising up. I sent an army. We put down the rebellion with a firm and uncompromising hand. Pugachev was captured and executed in Moscow Square. The uprising was over, but doubts remained. Under my rule, Russia has grown as never before. I conquered the Crimea, the Baltics, parts of Poland, territory in the Caucasus. The Russian Empire became the largest in the world, stretching across 3 continents. It looked majestic on the map. But what did it cost? How many lives? How much blood? Sometimes when I looked at those maps, I felt a weight. Each new province meant thousands of dead. It meant mothers without sons, wives without husbands, children without fathers. And yet I kept going, because it was my duty. Euripid admired me and feared me. Voltaire wrote to me, "You are the greatest monarch of Europe, Your Majesty." But others, like Burke in England, said, "He's a tyrant in skirts, a despot." Was I a tyrant? Perhaps, but I was also a visionary, a reformer, a woman who changed history. After each victory, I sat alone in my chamber. I was surrounded by maps, reports, letters from the generals. And I thought of the faces of those who died, the families I had destroyed. I was the ruler. I was strong. I was Catherine the Great. But I was also lonely, because power comes with a price, and I paid it every day. The war brought me glory. Expansion brought me greatness. But what did it take from me? It took my peace. It took my innocence.
And sometimes, in the still of the night, I wished I was just Sophie again. A little girl who dreamed of love. But that girl died a long time ago. And in her place stood Catherine the Great, the ruler who changed the world. Time passed inexorably. My body, once full of strength and passion, was slowly weakening. Memories of all I had been through came flooding back to me. The painful journey I had been through, the battles I had fought, the loves that had shaped me. It wasn't easy to accept, but I knew that even a powerful ruler must face his end. I often wondered what I would leave behind. Would it be my empire, vast and mighty, or just a shadow of my presence? I have thought of my intangible victories and painful defeats, the loneliness that followed me like a shadow, but also of the strength and courage with which fate had endowed me. My health was fragile. Pain receded like a mist over my days and nights. But I took every moment to tell my sons, my mentors and my people what I wanted them to remember. I told them, be strong, be just and be loving. My body will pass away, but my legacy will live on. My death on November 17th, 1796. My body was laid to rest in the church of Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg. Many in my life admired me. Some hated me. But no one can deny that my name will forever be written in the history of Russia and the world. My body no longer rests in stone and earth. But my spirit still remains in the heart of Russia, in its rivers and mountains, in the people who live here. What have I left behind? Not only a vast empire from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the largest in the world. Not only the laws and reforms that opened the door to freedom and education, but also the story of a woman who went from an unknown German girl to a Tsarina, a symbol of strength and will. I was a hard and sometimes cruel ruler, but I always believed in progress and reason. I remained a woman who feared, who loved, who was lonely, but never stopped dreaming. The story of my life is not just about power, but about the courage to be myself, in a time when being a woman meant being weak. And this was my story. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm Catherine the Great, and my legend lives on. If you like the video, I would be very grateful for your like, comment, and channel subscription. You will be supporting our channel, a place where together we keep historical stories alive. an echo of the past, where the past whispers and the future listens.